Did you know that the last Roman emperor in the West was not a mighty general or a wise old senator? He was a young boy, maybe just a teenager, and his name was, somewhat ironically, Romulus Augustulus. He was deposed in the year 476 CE, not in some grand battle, but actually in a pretty quiet political maneuver. This event is often taught as the definitive end of the Western Roman Empire. But honestly, the story is much more complicated than that. The fall of Rome wasn't a single event, like a building just collapsing in an earthquake. It was a long, slow process, full of change, decay, and transformation that played out over centuries. It was less of a sudden collapse and more like a gradual unraveling of a very complex system. Thinking about the fall of Rome is actually a bit misleading. For the people living at the time, there wasn't a single day when they just woke up and said, "The Roman Empire is over." Life went on, but it changed bit by bit. Roads fell into disrepair over decades. Roman coins became harder to find. New leaders with different titles and customs took over local governance. The idea of a single unified empire ruled from one magnificent city slowly faded from reality, even though it lingered in people's minds for a long time. This gradual shift is what makes the end of Rome one of history's most fascinating and debated puzzles. It really forces us to ask what we mean when we talk about the fall of a civilization. This period of transition reshaped the world in some pretty profound ways. The political unity of the Mediterranean, which had been held together by Roman legions and laws for centuries, fractured into lots of smaller kingdoms. This fragmentation actually laid the groundwork for the modern nations of Europe. The power of the Latin language splintered into the Romance languages we know today: French, Spanish, Italian, and so on. The Christian Church, which was once a persecuted sect, rose up to become a dominant political and cultural force in the power vacuum left by the emperors. Understanding this long transformation is really key to understanding the very foundations of the Western world. So, when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're really talking about the end of a particular kind of political and social order. The year 476 CE is a convenient marker, a useful date for historians to hang their hats on. But the real story? It's messier, more interesting, and honestly, much more human. It's a story of adaptation, survival, and the slow birth of a new world out of the husk of the old one. This essay is going to explore the many threads that, when woven together, tell the tale of how the mighty Roman Empire slowly came apart, and what that process meant for the future of the world. For over 1,000 years, Rome was more than just a city or an empire. It was an idea. It stood for order, law, civilization, and power, on a scale that really hadn't been seen before. From the misty frontiers of Britain all the way to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria, the Roman Empire connected millions of people under one system of governance. Its legions kept a kind of relative peace, the famous way, for centuries. Its engineers built aqueducts, roads, and cities that still stand today, showing off their skill. Its laws created a framework for justice that still influences legal systems all over the world. Rome was the superpower of its day, the center of the known world for so many people. The influence of Rome was just immense. It was a melting pot, cultures, religions, and peoples all contributing to a shared Roman identity. Latin became the language of government, law, and intellectual life in the West, while Greek remained the language of culture and commerce in the East. The empire's vast trade networks brought silk from China, spices from India, and grain from Egypt to feed its massive population. Being Roman was a source of pride and a real marker of status. Its achievements in architecture, literature, and philosophy set a standard that later civilizations would try to live up to for centuries to come. The legacy of Rome was so powerful that its shadow, in a way, still looms over us today. So, the end of this colossal entity wasn't just a local political event, it was a world-changing phenomenon. The collapse of central authority in the West led to a period of instability, conflict, and economic decline that people often call the Dark Ages. Now, that term is kind of oversimplified, but it does capture the sense of loss and disruption that followed the breakdown of Roman order. Trade routes collapsed, cities shrank, and literacy declined in a lot of regions. The sophisticated, interconnected world of the Roman Mediterranean fragmented into smaller, more isolated communities. Understanding why this happened isn't just for academics. Studying the end of the Roman Empire helps us see how fragile even the most powerful civilizations can be. It really makes us think about what actually holds a society together and what happens when those bonds start to weaken. Is it a strong economy, a powerful military, stable government, a shared sense of identity? The story of Rome's fall involves all these things and more. By examining its decline, we can learn some valuable lessons about the challenges that complex societies face, including our own. The questions Romans struggled with, economic inequality, political corruption, foreign threats, and social change, are questions that still matter to us today. To really understand the fall of Rome, we can't just point to a single cause. Instead, historians see a combination of interconnected problems that, over time, gradually weakened the empire from the inside out. These issues can be grouped into three main categories: political instability, economic crisis, and military difficulties. So think of the empire as a grand old building. For centuries it stood strong. But over time, cracks started to appear in its foundations, its walls, and its roof. One crack alone might not have been enough to bring it down, but together, they made the whole structure vulnerable to collapse when the storms of history began to rage. First, the political system became deeply unstable. The process of choosing a new emperor was often chaotic and violent. After the golden age of the 5 good emperors in the 2nd century CE, succession was rarely peaceful. Ambitious generals, powerful politicians, and even the emperor's own bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard, would often fight for the throne. This led to a cycle of civil wars, assassinations, and rapid turnover of rulers. During one especially chaotic period in the 3rd century, called the Crisis of the 3rd Century, there were more than 20 emperors in just 50 years. This constant political turmoil made long-term planning pretty much impossible and eroded public trust in the government. Second, the empire faced some really severe economic problems. Rome's vast economy was built on conquest, slave labor, and agriculture. But as the empire stopped expanding, the flow of new wealth and slaves dried up. The government struggled to pay its massive army and bureaucracy, so it started devaluing its currency by mixing in less precious metal. This led to runaway inflation, making people's savings worthless and disrupting trade. Heavy taxes were put on farmers and small business owners, driving many into poverty or forcing them to abandon their land. The gap between the extremely wealthy elite and the impoverished masses just kept growing, creating deep social tensions. Finally, the military, once the invincible backbone of the empire, faced huge challenges. The long borders of the empire were difficult and expensive to defend. Constant pressure from so-called barbarian tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks meant Rome needed a large and effective army, but it became harder and harder to recruit Roman citizens into the legions. The empire grew more and more reliant on hiring mercenaries and soldiers from the very barbarian tribes it was fighting against. While these soldiers could be effective, their loyalty was often to their commanders or whoever paid them, not to the idea of Rome itself. This created a military that wasn't always reliable and could even turn against the state. The Roman government was a complex machine, and right at its heart was the emperor. When the emperor was strong and capable, everything ran pretty smoothly. But starting in the 3rd century, the empire suffered from a chronic leadership crisis. The problem of succession was never really solved. The position of emperor wasn't always hereditary. Anyone with enough military power could try to claim it. This created a system where the surest path to the throne was through civil war. Ambitious generals stationed on the frontiers would march their legions on Rome to make their bid for power, plunging the empire into destructive internal conflicts. The crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 CE, really shows this political decay. In this half-century, emperors came and went with terrifying speed. Most were generals, declared emperor by their troops, ruling for a few months or years before being assassinated by a rival, or even their own soldiers. This period of barracks emperors made stable governance basically impossible. With the central government in constant chaos, the empire's ability to respond to external threats or manage its economy just collapsed. People in the provinces lost faith in Rome's ability to protect them, and the very idea of a unified empire began to fracture, with breakaway empires briefly forming in places like Gaul and Palmyra. Figures like Diocletian, who came to power in 284 CE, saw just how deep the crisis ran. He was a brilliant and ruthless reformer who understood that the empire was just too big and unwieldy for one person to rule effectively. He created the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four, dividing the empire into eastern and western halves, each with a senior emperor, an Augustus, and a junior emperor, a Caesar. This was a really radical attempt to restore order and make succession smoother. For a while, it actually worked. Diocletian's reforms stabilized the empire, but the system ultimately depended on the goodwill of the four rulers, and it collapsed back into civil war after his retirement. Constantine the Great, who eventually reunited the empire under his sole rule in the early 4th century, made another huge decision. He moved the capital of the empire from Rome to a new city in the east, Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. This move recognized a crucial reality. The center of the empire's wealth, population, and strategic importance had shifted eastward. While this strengthened the eastern half of the empire, it also, in a way, downgraded the city of Rome itself, both symbolically and practically. The Western Roman Empire was increasingly left to fend for itself, ruled by a succession of weaker and less effective emperors, which only hastened its decline. The mighty Roman war machine and the sprawling imperial bureaucracy were, honestly, incredibly expensive. At its peak, the empire funded these through the spoils of conquest and taxes from prosperous provinces. But by the 3rd century, the era of expansion was over. The empire was now on the defensive, and the costs of maintaining its vast frontiers were spiraling out of control. Without new lands to conquer and plunder, the government's income stream dwindled. To make up for the shortfall, emperors resorted to desperate measures. They raised taxes to crushing levels, particularly on the agricultural sector, which was really the backbone of the economy. This heavy tax burden had devastating effects on the common people. Small farmers, unable to pay the taxes, were often forced to sell their land to wealthy aristocratic landowners and become tenant farmers, or these were tied to the land, not quite slaves, but not truly free either. This system gradually transformed the rural landscape, creating vast estates known as worked by a dependent labor force. This eroded the class of independent citizen farmers, who had once been the strength of the Roman Republic. As wealth became concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite, the vast majority of the population sank into poverty, creating a society of haves and have-nots. At the same time, the government's decision to debase the currency created an inflationary crisis. To mint more coins to pay the soldiers, emperors mixed base metals like copper and tin into the silver. People quickly realized the coins were less valuable, so they demanded more of them for goods and services. Prices skyrocketed. A soldier's salary, which once could support a family, became almost worthless. Commerce broke down as people lost faith in money and reverted to a barter economy. The complex, interconnected market of the early empire began to disintegrate, replaced by localized, self-sufficient economies centered on the large estates of the wealthy. This economic decay also led to the physical decay of the empire's cities. With trade disrupted and public funds drying up, the great urban centers of the West began to shrink. Grand public buildings, temples, and forums were no longer maintained. Some were scavenged for materials to build defensive walls or private mansions. The population of the city of Rome itself, once over 1 million people, declined dramatically. People fled the cities to the countryside, seeking subsistence and protection on the estates of powerful landlords. This ruralization of society was a clear sign that the classical urban civilization of Rome was fading. The Roman army was the envy of the ancient world, For centuries, the disciplined, heavily armed legions were the ultimate symbol of Roman power, conquering territories and defending the frontiers. However, by the late Empire, this formidable military machine was creaking under immense strain. The empire's borders stretched for thousands of miles, from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the deserts of North Africa and the forests of Germany. Patrolling this vast perimeter was a monumental and costly task. The army was stretched thin, trying to fend off threats from multiple directions at once, which honestly was a strategic nightmare. One of the biggest problems was manpower. As the empire's citizen population stagnated or declined, it became harder to find enough recruits for the legions. Roman citizens, especially the wealthier ones, were increasingly unwilling to endure the hardships of military service. So, to fill the ranks, the state turned more and more to non-Romans. These recruits, often referred to as barbarians, were drawn from the Germanic tribes living along the frontiers. These men were often excellent soldiers, but their integration into the army created new problems. Their loyalties were sometimes questionable, and their presence barbarized the Roman army, changing its character, tactics, and equipment. This reliance on foreign soldiers had a profound political impact. Germanic chieftains and their warriors rose to high ranks within the Roman military command. Figures like Stilicho, a Vandal, and Ricimer, of Suebic and Visigothic descent, became the real power behind the throne in the Western Empire, acting as regents and kingmakers for weak puppet emperors. This created a dangerous situation where the Roman state was dependent on generals who were not ethnically or culturally Roman. Their personal ambitions often conflicted with the interests of the empire they were supposed to be defending, leading to betrayals and internal power struggles at the worst possible moments. Simultaneously, the pressure on the frontiers intensified. This was not a coordinated invasion, but rather a series of large-scale migrations. Groups like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks were themselves being pushed westward by the arrival of the Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia. Seeking land, safety, and a share of the empire's wealth, these groups crossed the Danube and Rhine rivers in huge numbers. Sometimes they came as raiders, but often they sought to be settled peacefully within the empire. Rome's handling of these migrations was often clumsy and brutal, turning potential allies into desperate enemies and leading to catastrophic military defeats, like the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where an entire Roman army and an emperor were destroyed. The decision to formally split the empire into two administrative halves, East and West, was a practical response to an undeniable reality. The empire had simply become too big to be governed effectively from a single center. The Emperor Diocletian's tetrarchy in the late 3rd century was the first formal recognition of this, but the cultural and economic divide had been growing for a long time. The East was historically Greek-speaking, more urbanized, had a larger population, and was far wealthier. The West was Latin-speaking, more rural, and its economy was less robust. This division, intended to make the empire more manageable, ultimately sealed the fate of the West. After Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople in 330 CE, the balance of power shifted decisively eastward. Constantinople was a strategic fortress, easily defended and perfectly positioned to control the rich trade routes between Europe and Asia. The Eastern emperors had access to the wealthy provinces of Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, which provided a steady stream of tax revenue and manpower. They were able to fund a strong army, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and impressive public works. The Eastern Roman Empire, which would later become known as the Byzantine Empire, had the resources to survive and even thrive for another 1,000 years. The Western Roman Empire, by contrast, was in a much more precarious position. Its capital was moved from Rome to Mediolanum, or Milan, and later to the easily defensible marshland city of Ravenna. Its provinces, like Gaul and Britain, were less wealthy and more exposed to constant barbarian raids. The Western government was perpetually short on funds, making it difficult to pay its armies and maintain its infrastructure. With the wealthier half of the empire operating largely independently, the West was left to face its immense political, economic, and military problems with dwindling resources. It was like a ship taking on water, with its main pumps located in the other half of the vessel. This separation was not always hostile. The two halves of the empire often cooperated and saw themselves as part of a single Roman world. But as time went on, their interests diverged. The East was more concerned with threats from Persia and along the Danube, while the West was consumed by the Germanic migrations across the Rhine. When the West faced its greatest crises in the 5th century, the East sometimes sent aid, but it was often too little, too late. The Eastern emperors were primarily focused on ensuring their own survival. The split, which began as a pragmatic administrative reform, ended up creating two very different destinies for the two halves of the Roman world. For 800 years, the city of Rome had been inviolable. Since its sacking by the Gauls in 390 BCE, no foreign enemy had managed to breach its walls. The Eternal City was the heart of the empire and a powerful symbol of Roman invincibility. That all changed in the year 410 CE. A force of Visigoths, led by their king, Alaric, entered and sacked the city of Rome for 3 days. Alaric had not set out to destroy Rome. He had been negotiating with the Western Roman government for land and supplies for his people, who were settled inside the empire's borders. When the negotiations broke down due to Roman intransigence, the frustrated Alaric marched on the poorly defended city. The physical damage from the sack of 410 CE was not as catastrophic as one might imagine. The Visigoths were Christians and largely spared the city's great churches. They were primarily interested in looting portable wealth, gold, silver, and precious goods. But the psychological impact was immense and resonated across the entire Roman world. The unthinkable had happened. The sacred center of the empire had been violated. Pagans blamed the disaster on the abandonment of the old gods, while Christians like St. Augustine of Hippo were forced to respond. He wrote his masterpiece, The City of God, to argue that the true city of believers was a spiritual one in heaven, not an earthly one like Rome. The sack of Rome was not the end, but it was a devastating blow to the prestige and morale of the Western Empire. It showed everyone that the Roman government could no longer protect even its most symbolic city. The event accelerated the process of fragmentation. Provinces saw that Rome was weak, and local Roman aristocrats and barbarian leaders began to carve out their own territories. Another, more brutal sack of Rome followed in 455 CE, this time by the Vandals, who had crossed from Spain to conquer North Africa, the breadbasket of the West. This second sack was far more destructive and further confirmed that imperial power in the West was collapsing. These events were turning points because they were such powerful and public demonstrations of the Western Empire's weakness. While the long-term causes of decline, like economic strain and political instability, had been eroding the empire for centuries, the sacks of Rome were dramatic symptoms of the disease. They shattered the aura of invincibility that had been one of Rome's greatest assets. The deposition of the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 CE by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, was almost an anticlimax. By then, the Western Roman emperor had become an irrelevant figure, and the real power was already in the hands of barbarian kings ruling over former Roman provinces. In the end, there was no single cause for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It was, honestly, a death by 1,000 cuts. A long-term crisis in political leadership created instability at the top. A deep-seated economic crisis, driven by inflation, heavy taxation, and reliance on slave labor, weakened the foundations of society. The military, overstretched and increasingly reliant on unreliable foreign mercenaries, could no longer defend the vast frontiers from the pressure of migrating peoples. The division of the empire into East and West left the western half resource-poor and vulnerable. All these factors fed into one another, creating a downward spiral from which the West could not recover. The legacy of Rome, however, did not die with the last emperor in the West. It lived on and transformed. The most immediate and powerful inheritor of Rome's legacy was the Christian Church. It adopted Rome's administrative structure, dioceses, its official language, Latin, and its position as a unifying force in Europe. The Pope in Rome took on the title Pontifex Maximus, a title once held by the Roman emperors. For centuries, the idea of a universal Christian commonwealth replaced the idea of a universal Roman Empire. Roman law was also preserved, studied, and eventually incorporated into the legal systems of many modern European nations. The idea of Rome itself proved incredibly resilient. Leaders from Charlemagne to Napoleon to the founders of the United States looked to the Roman Republic and Empire as a model for their own states, borrowing its symbols, the eagle, its architectural styles, and its political concepts like the Senate. The languages that evolved from Latin, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian now connect hundreds of millions of people. Our calendar, many of our laws, and our ideals of republican government are all part of the long shadow cast by this ancient civilization. Rome did not so much fall as it dissolved, its constituent parts becoming the building blocks of the world that followed. So, what do you think was the most important factor in Rome's decline? Was it the internal decay of its political and economic systems? Or was it the external pressure from barbarian migrations? Perhaps it was a cultural shift, a loss of the traditional Roman values and civic virtues. The debate continues because the story of Rome is a mirror in which we see the challenges of our own complex world. To better understand these patterns of rise and fall, one might explore the histories of other great empires such as the Han Dynasty in China, the Persian Empire, or the Ottoman Empire. Each holds its own lessons about power, society, and the inevitable passage of time. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like, comment with your thoughts on Rome's fall, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from the past.